Close your eyes and imagine a library so old that dust itself speaks in whispers. The shelves slope with the weight of centuries. Paper creaks like leaves in autumn when touched. In the hush between the stacks, you might hear the faintest echo of a footstep, a historian in a wool coat, a careful hand turning a brittle folio. History, in its ordinary life, is built of such small gestures, the careful cataloguing of a name, the patient mapping of a border, the steady ink that makes an account permanent. But sometimes in that quiet, a different sound slips in, a sigh, a question. What if what we have learned is only one telling among many? What if some pages were never placed on the shelf? This story begins with that whisper, not as accusation but as curiosity. Imagine a child in a museum, pressing her small face to the glass at a relic labeled with a date and a place. The plaque tells a tidy story: who made this, when, and why, but the child senses something more, a missing moment, a pause where questions could be. Histories are constructed by people with hands that tremble and eyes that remember. They choose which facts to place in the light and which to tuck into drawers. That choice is not always malevolence. It is often the human instinct to order a chaotic world into a readable narrative. Yet where there is selection, there is also omission. And omission can, in the long wash of time, look very much like forgetting or, worse, like a cover-up. Cover-up is a heavy word, dramatic and accusing. Here, we speak of subtler things, the gentle erasure that comes from power and convenience, the stories that polite society prefers not to tell, and the mistakes that are convenient to leave uncorrected. Picture an empire writing the history of its victories in marble and gold. The victor's monument stands tall in a square, and the vanquished become a footnote in a traveler's guide. That is not necessarily a plot hatched in a dim room. Sometimes it is the practical result of who has the money to commission statues and who only has tears. Other times, there are intentional acts, documents locked away, inconvenient papers misfiled, maps redrawn without the voices of those who lack to say. These are the slow arts of forgetting. They do not always march like armies, they seep like water under a door. But before we hand the word lie to history, let us taste it gently on the tongue. A lie implies intention and collaboration in falsehood. Often the truth is more layered, misremembering, misunderstandings, and the natural human desire to simplify. Imagine the scribes of a medieval court, copying texts by candlelight. A marginal note might be misread and become part of the narrative, a phrase mistranslated and then taught for generations as fact. Over centuries, these small errors compound. A map of a coastline, drawn from a sailor's shaky recollection, could become the authoritative shape of a nation's story. A single error, repeated, becomes a tradition. There are also stories people tell themselves to survive. In times of crisis, communities need narratives that help them endure. Myths form like blankets across the cold. A people who suffered a catastrophe may tell a tale in which their loss is recast as noble sacrifice, or in which their suffering is the prelude to a destined revival. These stories are not lies in the malicious sense, they are the human heart's way of making sense of suffering. Yet when those comforting tales become the only narrative taught in schools and recited in ceremonies, they harden into versions of history that exclude alternate truths, the voices of the ordinary people, of the defeated, of the dissenters. And then there is discovery, a sudden wind that flips the pages of the past. Archaeology, new forensics, a sealed archive opened publicly. Each is a moment when a hidden voice can re-enter the conversation. Imagine, for a moment, an excavation near a dusty hill where children once played. A team uncovers bones arranged not in a burial the town remembers, but in a pattern that suggests a ritual no one was taught about. Or a set of letters found in a diplomat's chest revealing a negotiation gone differently than the official record states. These discoveries act like miner's lamps, illuminating corners once left in shadow. They do not always upend the whole story. Often they enrich it, adding texture and humanity where there had been only a bare outline. In quiet rooms, historians gather these fragments and speak softly to each other, like gardeners tending a wild plot. They debate, cross-check, translate, and sometimes revise entire chapters of our shared account. Revision is not betrayal, it is the labor of honesty. The scientist who re-examines a fossil and reassigns a species is not destroying the past but refining it. Likewise, the scholar who unearths an inconvenient ledger and publishes it is not dismantling civilization, they are allowing truth to breathe. The slow public acceptance of nuance, the idea that history is not a single book but a library of voices, is the antidote to the fear that everything we know might be a lie. Now imagine a storyteller, a calm voice meant for the night, who tells you that what if is both a challenge and a lullaby. It is a challenge because it asks us to question authoritative narratives, to look deeper and ask who benefits from a particular telling. It is a lullaby because it invites a gentler posture, to consider without rage, to reflect without cynicism. Because the more we cultivate a humble curiosity, the less likely we are to fall for the easy seduction of grand conspiracies. Grand claims often require grand proof. More often, the art of history is in noticing the small contradictions, a footnote that doesn't add up, a portrait that smiles when the biography says otherwise, a merchant's diary that tells of everyday life unaffected by the grand proclamations of kings. That careful noticing also brings ethical responsibility. When a hidden truth surfaces that redresses an injustice, for example, the exposure of a long-ignored massacre or the recognition of a community's erased cultural heritage, the moral work is not finished by mere discovery. It asks of us to listen, to make space for repair, and to let the newly revealed voices be heard in the institutions that have the power to change. And when evidence shows that a once cherished narrative was incomplete or biased, revision is not betrayal but repair. The community that reweaves its story with humility becomes, in the long run, stronger and more compassionate. So, slip deeper into the hush of the story. Picture the museum, the archive, the village council, the university library, places where histories are made, told, or forgotten. See the hands that write and the hands that hold back. Not every omission is a crime, not every correction is a scandal. But there are moments when the line between narrative and agenda blurs, and the human cost of forgetting becomes visible in lives and landscapes. Our task, as listeners and dreamers in the night, is not to accuse without cause but to remain kindly vigilant. To be curious without cruelty. To welcome discovery with care. As the candle beside you gutturingly shifts and the page in your lap softens beneath your thumb, keep this gentle question with you. What stories have we loved so much that we stopped asking if they were whole? Let it nestle in your thoughts like a small stone at the bottom of a pond, causing concentric circles to radiate outward. In the chapters to come, we will follow those ripples into archives, into forgotten corners of cities, into the lives of people who kept secrets and those who dared to tell them. We will learn how history can be both a mirror and a mask, and how, when gently examined, it invites us not to mistrust the past, but to love it more honestly. Sleep, for now, in the soft knowledge that questions are not accusations but keys to deeper understanding. The world is a wide, layered place, and every discovery is an invitation to make more room at the table of memory. We will meet again in the next chapter, where the lamp is brighter and the clues more deliberate, where cover-ups begin as whispers and grow into decisions that shape whole generations. Rest, and let the whisper of pages soothe you into curiosity. The night stretches softly, and with it, the world unfolds like an old parchment, wide, cracked, and fragrant with time. Imagine a table illuminated by a single lantern. A cartographer sits there, pen poised, tracing coastlines he has never seen, guided only by rumor and the fading ink of those who came before. Every map begins as a promise, an attempt to capture the living earth in lines and symbols. But like all promises, it holds within it the possibility of error, omission, and imagination. And that, dear listener, is where history begins to blur. Maps, after all, are stories told by power. They claim to represent the world, but they are not the world. They are agreements, sometimes fragile ones, between what we know and what we wish to claim. Long ago, when sailors returned from distant voyages, they would bring with them not only spices and tales, but sketches, coastlines sketched by trembling hands, dotted islands born from fog and misdirection. These sketches would be copied, embellished, and printed, soon finding their way into atlases that shaped the world's understanding of itself. But many of those islands were never real. Some lands existed only in imagination, born of error, or perhaps, of convenience. And yet they appeared in classrooms and libraries for centuries, shaping the borders of belief. Close your eyes and picture the lost island of Brazil, once marked off the west coast of Ireland. It appeared on maps for over 200 years, said to rise from the mist every 7 years before vanishing again. Sailors searched for it endlessly, kings issued charters claiming its discovery. But it was never found, because it never was. And yet, its ghost lived on in documents, trade routes, and even in stories of explorers who swore they had glimpsed its shores in twilight haze. History absorbed it as if it had flesh and soil. That is how a myth becomes geography and how geography becomes truth. But not all forgotten maps are the result of fantasy. Some are crafted with deliberate silence. There are maps that remember empire but forget the people beneath it, maps that draw neat lines through deserts where nomads once roamed freely, maps that name continents after conquerors while erasing the tongues of those who lived there first. These are not errors of ignorance. They are choices of perspective. To draw a map is to declare ownership of space, of memory, of the right to define what is important. And when cartographers served kings, merchants, or colonizers, they drew not the earth as it was, but the world as power desired it to be. Think of the ancient city of Tenochtitlan, a jewel of canals, gardens, and shining temples that once sat where Mexico City now stands. When Spanish conquerors arrived, they were astonished by its order and beauty. Yet when they mapped it for Europe, they altered its scale and orientation. The city became smaller on paper, its complexity reduced to neat lines that could fit within the imperial frame. The result was not just a new drawing but a new truth, one that diminished the greatness of a culture so that conquest might seem inevitable. For centuries, those maps were treated as fact. The story of a thriving civilization became a tale of a primitive empire discovered by a superior world. And in that sleight of hand, history itself was rewritten. Now, drift your thoughts to another table, centuries later a wartime office filled with smoke and murmuring voices. Maps are pinned to walls, flags stuck in territories like silent stakes. Lines move daily, borders advancing and retreating like breaths. Soldiers march where pencils once traced. Here, the power of maps becomes literal, each stroke of ink may seal a fate. When the war ends, diplomats gather around another map, redrawing the world once more. Whole nations vanish or appear overnight. And somewhere, far from the negotiating table, a village wakes to find itself suddenly belonging to a new country it has never heard of. Language, law, and loyalty shift, not because of war, but because of a map. In such moments, history does not lie outright, it merely forgets. It forgets the farmers whose fields are cut in half by invisible lines, the traders whose routes are declared foreign, the children who grow up between borders and belong to neither side. The maps hang proudly in embassies and museums, symbols of order and peace. But for those who live on the margins of those lines, the world becomes smaller, stranger, and less their own. Yet not all maps deceive in malice. Some simply mirror the limits of human understanding. In ancient China, early cartographers drew the world centered on their emperor's capital, surrounded by lands that grew hazier with distance. In medieval Europe, maps placed Jerusalem at the heart of creation, the world radiating outward like petals around a divine core. Each culture believed its map to be truth, not realizing that every perspective is both a window and a wall. The universe we chart is shaped by where we stand. And now, let us turn to the quiet revolution of rediscovery. In recent years, satellites and digital mapping have uncovered what older maps concealed: forgotten cities beneath jungles, trade routes buried under desert sands, and riverbeds that once connected civilizations long before written history. Technology, it seems, is giving us new eyes, but even now, bias lingers. Algorithms may still prioritize modern borders and political definitions, just as royal surveyors once did. The map remains a mirror of intention. The question, then, is not whether the map lies, but whose truth it tells. In one dusty archive in Lisbon, a historian once found a small sketch folded into a 16th-century logbook, a crude drawing of a coast marked only terra incognita. Beneath it, a faint line of text read, "The people here live beyond our understanding." That note, in its humility, might be the most honest map ever drawn. It admits uncertainty. It honors mystery. And perhaps that is what history, too, should learn to do, to hold space for what it does not yet know. As you drift toward sleep, imagine the vast ocean of time and memory, stretching endlessly in all directions. Beneath its surface, islands glimmer faintly, some real, some imagined, all connected by invisible currents of curiosity. The map-makers of old may have drawn monsters in the margins where their knowledge ended, warning sailors, "Here be dragons." But perhaps those dragons were simply metaphors for the unknown, the places yet unlearned, the truths yet unspoken. The dragons were not dangers, they were invitations. So when you wake tomorrow and look at a map on a screen, in a book, or in your mind, remember this gentle truth: no map is final, and no story complete. The world shifts, as do the ways we describe it. Our task, as keepers of memory, is to continue drawing, not with arrogance, but with awe. For every forgotten coastline and every erased border still whispers a name that deserves to be heard again. Rest now, traveler of time. The next chapter will take us beyond maps into the palaces of kings, the scrolls of priests, and the archives where truth and power have long shared a complicated sleep. In the hush of an old monastery library, time does not pass, it lingers. Dust drifts like soft snow over ancient tables. Candles burn low, their flames steady against the breath of centuries. Somewhere in that dim light, a monk bends over a parchment, his quill moving with slow devotion. Outside, the world shifts with kings and wars, but here, beneath the weight of silence, the past is being preserved or rewritten. The chronicles born in such places are more than records, they are bridges between memory and power. They hold within their lines both truth and obedience, both faith and fear. And in their careful calligraphy, history takes shape and sometimes hides itself. The earliest historians were not neutral observers, they were servants of gods and rulers. Their ink was a tool of faith, their parchment an offering. The chronicles they wrote were often acts of loyalty, not deceit, but duty. When a scribe wrote that a king was chosen by heaven, he did not imagine he was lying, he was protecting order in a fragile world. To question a ruler's divine right was to question the sun's rising. And so, history was written as harmony, even when the melody of truth was more discordant. Empires grew upon such chronicles, gilded with certainty and sanctified by repetition. Over time, those words hardened into fact. Yet beneath those official pages, quieter texts lived in shadow. Letters between scholars, journals of travelers, and the secret notes of priests sometimes told a different tale. Many were hidden away, sealed in boxes, buried beneath floorboards, or disguised as prayers. Some were never meant to be read at all, confessions whispered to posterity. One such letter, found centuries later in a Florentine archive, told of a monk who altered royal birth records to legitimize a young prince's claim to the throne. "Forgive me," he wrote in Latin, "for I have made truth obedient to peace." His confession was not defiance but sorrow. He believed the falsification would prevent a civil war. History, for him, was a tool of mercy and thus, another form of faith. But faith and fear often share the same inkpot. In medieval courts, chroniclers were expected to glorify their patrons. To omit a victory or exaggerate a triumph was not manipulation but loyalty. Yet with each flourish of exaggeration, the distance between fact and story widened. When later generations read these chronicles, they mistook reverence for reality. Myths hardened into events, miracles became milestones. The result was not a grand conspiracy but a gradual drift, the slow current of bias carrying truth downstream, until it settled far from its source. ChatGPT. Still, not all chronicles were made to flatter. Some were written to warn. In the courts of ancient China, imperial historians were known to keep two records, one for the emperor, one for history. The first contained what the ruler wanted to hear, the second, what truly happened. The secret version was often hidden until long after the ruler's death. It was a quiet rebellion in ink, a way for truth to survive tyranny. These hidden chronicles remind us that even within systems built to silence, there are those who resist with quills instead of swords. Now, close your eyes and imagine the scent of old paper, warm, faintly sweet, tinged with candle smoke. In those pages lie stories never meant for the public eye, forbidden books that challenged doctrine, scientific observations that threatened dogma, philosophies deemed too dangerous for the common soul. When inquisitors came to burn heretical works, Some monks faked their destruction, replacing them with blank parchment soaked in ash to mimic char. The originals were tucked behind false walls or beneath chapel floors, waiting for an age more forgiving. Some of those texts have resurfaced, not all, but enough to remind us how much the world once feared free thought. The Renaissance, that great rebirth of knowledge, was as much an act of recovery as discovery. In dusty storerooms, forgotten manuscripts were found, Greek texts on medicine, astronomy, and philosophy that had been lost for over a millennium. Their rediscovery reshaped Europe's mind, turning darkened faith into illuminated reason. But it also revealed something humbling. Entire centuries of human understanding had existed beyond the Church's sanctioned history. The world had been far wider than its recorded memory allowed. And for every scroll recovered, there were others still lost, burned, or erased. The silence of those absences still lingers, a reminder that history is not only what survives, but what is allowed to survive. Yet, even today, hidden chronicles persist, not in parchment, but in digital vaults and classified archives. Governments guard their secrets with the same instinct as kings once did. Documents sealed for 50 years for national security are the modern equivalent of those locked monastery chests. Perhaps one day they too will be opened, revealing not grand conspiracies but the familiar pattern of human frailty, errors, pride, fear, and the desperate need to control how the story will be told. The mediums have changed, but the instinct is eternal. Humanity, it seems, cannot resist editing its own memory. Still, not all secrets are sinister. Some are acts of protection. In war-torn regions, archivists have risked their lives to hide cultural treasures, manuscripts, artworks, and oral histories from destruction. When the bombs fell on Sarajevo in 1992, librarians formed human chains to rescue volumes from burning buildings. When extremists threatened ancient Timbuktu, villagers smuggled manuscripts out of the city in boxes labeled mangoes. These were not acts of deceit but defiance. They saved the voices of civilizations that others sought to erase. Hidden histories, when protected in love, become acts of resistance, not lies, but shields for truth. In quiet contrast, consider the archives that were never meant to be found: letters destroyed by heirs ashamed of family secrets, field notes abandoned because they contradicted official expeditions, testimonies ignored because they came from the wrong voices, women, slaves, colonized people, or commoners. History has always had a hierarchy of listenability. For every king's decree preserved in marble, there is a grandmother's story told in whispers and then forgotten. When those voices reappear through oral history projects, DNA research, or recovered recordings, they expand our collective truth. The past becomes fuller, warmer, and more human. So, as the night deepens and you listen to the soft turn of imaginary pages, remember that the story of history is also the story of forgetting. The hidden chronicles are not only about censorship but about silence, the silence we inherit and the silence we choose to break. To study them is not to accuse the past but to understand it. Every age edits its memory, every generation decides what to carry forward and what to let fade. The wisest among us are those who understand that every record, whether carved in stone or stored in a cloud, is both a revelation and a veil. Now, breathe. Let your mind drift through a corridor of shelves that stretch endlessly into the dark. Each book glows faintly, as if lit from within by the memory of the hands that made it. Some spines are gilded, others cracked, but each holds a fragment of who we were and who we are still becoming. The chronicles do not judge, they wait. And perhaps, if you listen closely, you'll hear them whisper, "We are not lies, we are versions." Tomorrow, when the world wakes, historians will still argue over what was true and what was lost. But tonight, you may rest in the comfort that truth, though hidden, never dies. It only sleeps, waiting for a gentle mind to lift the cover and read once more. There was a time when truth itself wore a crown. It was carried through marble halls on parchment scrolls, sealed in wax, and spoken only by those permitted to speak. The empire of truth did not rise through wisdom or compassion, it was built through control. In every civilization, from the pharaoh's Egypt to the papal courts of medieval Europe, rulers understood a quiet principle: power does not need to own the land if it owns the story told about it. And so, history became less a mirror of reality and more a map of obedience. In the golden age of empires, truth was a possession. Kings commissioned their own legends, generals hired poets to immortalize their victories. The past was curated like a garden, weeds of doubt removed, flowers of glory carefully arranged. When a battle was lost, it was often described as a strategic retreat. When a people were conquered, their suffering was rewritten as civilization. In palaces and cathedrals, scribes worked not as seekers of knowledge but as architects of memory. Each empire called its version of history divine, and each silenced the others. The empire of truth was not built on lies alone, it was built on the luxury of who got to define what truth meant. The Roman Empire understood this better than most. Their historians, like Livy and Tacitus, wrote not only to record but to instruct. They shaped the past into moral theater heroes, traitors, and the noble destiny of Rome. Their chronicles were filled with lessons of virtue and power, not uncertainty or contradiction. When emperors fell, their statues were torn down, their names chiseled off monuments, damnatio memoriae, the erasure of memory. It was not enough to kill a rival, one had to kill their story, too. And so, even oblivion became a political act. The Empire of Truth learned that to control the present, one must first control what the past is allowed to be. Centuries later, the Church inherited this empire's ghost. Knowledge, once the domain of many, was gathered into the hands of the few, copied, translated, and filtered through the language of faith. In candlelit rooms, monks preserved ancient texts, yet some lines vanished between translations. Entire philosophies were softened, rewritten to fit within the doctrine. The sacred became a sieve for the secular. Where a Greek thinker had once questioned the gods, the Latin version praised divine order. It was a gentle, almost invisible rewriting, one meant not to deceive, but to align the human thirst for meaning with the institution's need for certainty. Faith became history's editor. Then came the explorers, emissaries of the empire, crossing seas in search of gold, glory, and God. They carried with them not just weapons and maps, but stories. When they arrived in foreign lands, they named mountains, renamed rivers, and wrote entire continents into being as though they had been discovered from nothing. The empires at home published these accounts as heroic tales. They spoke of new worlds, not realizing they were extinguishing old ones. Indigenous histories, unwritten but deeply remembered, were dismissed as myth. The Empire of Truth demanded written proof and then used writing as the weapon of exclusion. What was not inscribed was not believed. What was not believed was erased. Every ruler, every empire, every nation has at some point declared its own version of the truth absolute. We are the light, they say, and all before us was darkness. Yet light, when too bright, blinds. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as Europe entered its so-called Age of Enlightenment, knowledge itself became an empire. Scholars, scientists, and philosophers sought to order the world through reason. But even reason carries its shadows. The great encyclopedias of that era categorized not only facts but people, defining races, assigning hierarchies, and justifying conquest under the banner of civilization. It was truth wearing a new crown, a crown of logic instead of faith, but a crown nonetheless. The Empire of Truth thrives on belief, not in gods or kings, but in the comfort of certainty. Humans crave narratives that make sense, even if they are not fully true. A clean story is easier to worship than a complicated one. And so, institutions, political, religious, academic, offer the same bargain across centuries. Trust us, and we will give you the truth. But every bargain hides a price. The more we rely on one voice to define the past, the quieter all other voices become. Truth, like empire, grows vast but fragile. The higher it rises, the more it fears the wind of doubt. Still, resistance always survives, often in the margins. During the Inquisition, heretical texts were copied by night and passed hand to hand. During colonial rule, enslaved and indigenous people sang their histories in code, hiding truths in rhythm and myth. Even within totalitarian states, poets wrote in symbols and metaphors, preserving forbidden memory beneath the censor's gaze. These were not revolts with weapons but with words, rebellions of remembrance. Each whispered song, each hidden diary was an act of quiet revolution against the Empire of Truth. Today, our empires no longer wear robes or crowns. They wear logos and servers. Information flows freely, yet confusion reigns. The modern world has traded censorship for saturation, not silence, but noise. Algorithms decide which truths we see, which histories resurface, and which fade beneath trending distractions. The empire of truth has become decentralized, but no less controlling. The question is no longer who writes history, but who programs it. And as before, those who hold the pen or the code shape not only memory, but meaning itself. Yet in this chaos, there is hope. Because for the first time, history's ownership is contested not by kings, but by everyone. Digitized archives, oral history projects, and forgotten voices are emerging from the shadows. Ancient languages are being decoded, indigenous calendars are being restored. The empire of truth is cracking, not collapsing, but transforming. The world is learning that there is no single truth of the past, only a constellation of truths seen from different eyes. And in that realization, humanity rediscovers humility. So let us end this step with a vision, a soft, glowing library without walls. Shelves made of light, filled with memories from every culture, every faith, every forgotten voice. There, a Babylonian scribe's tablet rests beside an Amazonian shaman's chant, a medieval nun's journal beside an African griot's song. None claims supremacy, all exist together, breathing in quiet harmony. This is the dream beyond the empire, not the destruction of truth, but its liberation. As you drift toward sleep, remember this: power can command words, but never meaning. Meaning belongs to those who seek, who question, who refuse to let history harden into dogma. The empire of truth may still stand, but its gates are open, and through them, we walk gently, carrying candles instead of swords. Beneath the surface of our modern world, under layers of stone and sand, sleeps another world entirely, a world built by hands that no longer exist, guided by minds whose dreams we can only imagine. These are the lost civilizations, the quiet ghosts of humanity's earliest brilliance. They do not scream to be remembered, they hum softly through the ruins, whispering that the story of mankind is far older, deeper, and stranger than the pages we have read. Every shovel that touches ancient earth uncovers not only relics but doubts about who we are and how far back our footsteps truly go. The sands of Egypt were once the guardians of one such whisper. Long before the first pyramid pierced the sky, older stones lay beneath eroded monuments and carvings that hinted at forgotten builders. Some researchers claimed that water, not wind, shaped the Sphinx's body, meaning it could be thousands of years older than accepted history allows. The desert had become a library, its pages sealed by time. And perhaps that was no accident. Dynasties rewrote dynasties, each pharaoh proclaimed himself the sun reborn, erasing the light of those before. What we call ancient Egypt may itself have been a copy of something older, a civilization swallowed twice by sand. Travel east, and the stones rise again in the valleys of India. Along the dried bed of the Saraswati River, archaeologists have found cities of the Indus, Harappa, and Mohenjo-Daro planned with mathematical precision. Streets laid in perfect grids, drainage systems more advanced than those of medieval Europe. Yet these people left behind no grand monuments, no boastful inscriptions. Their script remains undeciphered, their rulers unknown. It is as if an entire culture decided to speak not to us, but to the earth itself. Then, one day, they vanished, perhaps to drought, perhaps to war, perhaps to a silence we cannot name. The empire of truth, as we saw before, favors those who shout. The Indus whispered, and so history forgot. Across the ocean, another enigma rose from jungle mist, the Maya. For centuries, their temples slept beneath roots and vines until explorers rediscovered them, calling them lost. But were they ever truly gone? The descendants of the Maya still live, still speak the language of their ancestors, still count time in cycles more complex than our calendars. It was the Western gaze that declared them vanished, for to the conqueror, survival without submission looks like disappearance. The myth of lost civilizations often hides a quieter truth, that they were not lost, but erased from the story by those who wished to be its only authors. Then there are ruins that defy even legend. The megaliths of Baalbek, the terraces of Puma Punku, the sunken stones off the coast of Japan at Yonaguni, their builders remain unnamed, their tools unimagined. Some stones weigh hundreds of tons, carved and placed with impossible precision. Modern engineers argue over how such feats could be achieved without steel, wheels, or machines. And yet, there they stand, mute witnesses to forgotten ingenuity. Perhaps they were built by cultures that mastered nature differently, not through force but resonance, sound, vibration, magnetism. Or perhaps our ancestors simply knew more about harmony than conquest, and we, in our arrogance, cannot yet hear the music they left behind. In South America, high in the Andes, the city of Tiwanaku sits like a question carved in stone. Legends say it was built by the gods before the first sunrise. Its gates align with celestial events, suggesting a calendar far more ancient than the Incan Empire that came after. Nearby, at Lake Titicaca, divers have found submerged temples, as if a civilization once flourished there before the earth shifted and the waters rose. Could it be that great floods remembered in myth, from Noah's Ark to the Epic of Gilgamesh, were not tales of divine wrath, but memories of real cataclysms, carried in stories through generations until they became sacred truth? Each discovery bends the timeline, and with each bend, historians must choose to adjust the narrative or to guard it. Many discoveries that challenge accepted chronology are dismissed as anomalies, out-of-place artifacts, impossible dates, misinterpretations. But what if they are fragments of a history deliberately hidden, pieces of an ancient puzzle we are not yet allowed to complete? Imagine if somewhere, beneath polar ice or ocean depths, lies a record of humanity's first civilization, a mother culture from which all others learned. Plato's Atlantis, the Indian Dwarka, the Sumerian Eridu, the legends of Mu and Lemuria, different names, perhaps one origin. The ancients called it the Age of the Gods, we might call it the Age of Forgotten Men. Yet the purpose of exploring lost civilizations is not to prove myth, but to rediscover wonder. For in these ruins lies a reflection of ourselves. Every fallen city is a warning that brilliance without balance collapses, that power without memory repeats its own mistakes. When we gaze upon a broken temple wall or a shattered idol, we are not only seeing the end of something old, we are seeing a mirror held to our own fragility. Civilizations are not lost because they vanish, they are lost because they stop listening to the silence between their own triumphs. In the stillness of the night, imagine walking through these ruins, moonlight on ancient stone, wind whispering through corridors where prayers once echoed. You touch the carvings, feel the fingerprints of those who lived and loved thousands of years ago. Their hopes, their fears, their songs still hum beneath your fingertips. History calls them primitive, but the heart knows better. They were dreamers, engineers, astronomers, poets. They looked up at the same stars and wondered, as we do now, who built the first fire, who spoke the first word, who told the first lie. Perhaps that is why these civilizations were forgotten, because their truths were too large, their wisdom too free. Power prefers order, mystery resists it. So the chronicles closed their pages, leaving only ruins as testimony. But the earth remembers what ink forgets. And one day, when the last empire has fallen silent, these stones will speak again. So tonight, as you close your eyes, picture a map without borders, glowing faintly beneath the surface of the world, a network of ancient light connecting pyramids, temples, and stone circles across continents. It is not a map of territory, but of memory. Somewhere within it lies the first story ever told, the story of all of us, before we divided truth from myth. And if history has lied, then perhaps the lie was only this, that we are young. For the soul of humanity is as old as the stars, and the lost civilizations were never truly lost, they are simply waiting for us to remember. Throughout time, knowledge has never belonged to everyone. It has always been guarded, sometimes by priests, sometimes by kings, sometimes by scholars who feared that truth, if exposed, might burn brighter than any crown could withstand. The guardians of secrets were not villains or saints, they were the gatekeepers of human memory. Their purpose was simple but perilous, to decide which truths the world was ready to see, and which should remain sealed behind the iron doors of time. And so, even as empires rose and fell, a quiet continuity endured, a thread woven through monasteries, temples, libraries, and laboratories, carrying the forbidden wisdom of ages. In the deserts of Egypt, after the fall of the old dynasties, a handful of scribes gathered in secret, preserving scrolls from temples that were set to be burned. They called themselves the Keepers of the Dawn. Their writings told not of gods as rulers, but as teachers, beings who came from the stars and shared knowledge of light and mathematics. When the new priests condemned these tales as heresy, the scrolls vanished into underground chambers, sealed beneath layers of sand and silence. Centuries later, fragments of these same ideas appeared in Greek philosophy, Babylonian myth, and even Renaissance alchemy, proof that the keeper's secrets had found their way back into the human bloodstream, disguised as legend. Far to the west, another order rose from the ashes of empire, the Library of Alexandria, a beacon of wisdom that once held nearly all known knowledge of the ancient world. But the library was more than a collection of scrolls. It was a network of scholars, travelers, and priests who corresponded across continents. They traded star maps from Persia, healing arts from India, and geometry from Egypt. For a brief time, the world was united under the pursuit of truth. Then came the fires, whether by war, decree, or divine will, no one truly knows. But when the flames consumed the shelves, some claim that the most sacred volumes had already been smuggled out, carried east by a small circle of scholars who would later seed the secret schools of Byzantium and, centuries after, the hidden chambers beneath the Vatican. Yes, the Vatican archives, a labyrinth of knowledge beneath Rome, stretching for miles, containing documents that have never seen daylight. Popes and cardinals once believed that divine truth must be protected from human corruption, or perhaps, that power must be protected from divine truth. Locked within those vaults are maps of lands drawn centuries before their discovery, records of celestial events unexplainable by early astronomy, and letters between popes and emperors discussing relics that defied natural law. The guardians changed their robes and languages over the centuries, but the oath remained the same: to keep the world orderly, truth must sometimes sleep. Then came the Middle Ages, when secret knowledge went underground, literally. The Templars, known for their courage in battle, were also seekers of forbidden knowledge. They unearthed relics in Jerusalem that scholars still whisper about, scrolls, objects, perhaps even blueprints of sacred geometry that mapped the connection between Earth's energy lines and ancient monuments. Their sudden fall, accused of heresy, tortured, executed, was less about gold and more about silence. The Church feared what they had uncovered, evidence that divine wisdom might be universal, older than any religion. When the Templars vanished, they did not vanish entirely. Their symbols reappeared centuries later among the Freemasons, who inherited both their architecture and their secrecy. In the East, the Guardians took another form: the Tibetan monks, the keepers of the Bon traditions, who stored ancient manuscripts in caves high above the world. Within those scrolls were cosmologies that described the creation of the universe not in days or miracles, but in vibrations, cycles, and infinite consciousness, eerily close to the theories of modern quantum physics. Yet, their texts were written millennia ago. How could men of Stone Age tools speak of energy fields and atomic resonance? The answer lies in transmission, an unbroken lineage of wisdom that flowed quietly through time, crossing mountains and oceans in the minds of those entrusted to guard it. During the Renaissance, as science reawakened, the Guardians took on new disguises. They became alchemists, astronomers, and artists, encoding sacred truths into art and invention. Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, Galileo's telescopes, Newton's symbols all contained fragments of an older language. The laws of gravity, perspective, anatomy, and chemistry, these were not discoveries, but rediscoveries, glimpses of wisdom long buried. Even the famous painting of the Last Supper hides geometrical alignments and cosmic proportions, reminders that truth, when censored, will always find another canvas. But as centuries passed, guardianship changed from preservation to control. In the modern age, secrecy became power. Governments formed classified archives, intelligence divisions, and black projects, not to protect humanity's innocence, but to protect their own advantage. Ancient artifacts, once symbols of wonder, became military assets. UFO files, archaeological anomalies, forbidden patents, all stored behind locked doors, all denied with a smile. The new Guardians wear suits, not robes. They operate under codes of silence instead of oaths of purity. Yet, the purpose remains familiar: to keep the world believing that history began only when it was written. What, then, is the cost of this guardianship? Perhaps the greatest loss is not the knowledge itself, but our right to wonder. When mystery is hidden, curiosity withers. When truth is rationed, imagination fades. The guardians may claim to protect us from chaos, but in doing so, they chain the very spirit that made civilization possible, the urge to ask why. The world's religions began as questions turned into parables, its sciences began as myths turned into theories. To suppress either is to deny our humanity. And yet, not all guardians are deceivers. Some still keep the light alive quietly: archaeologists who risk their careers to publish forbidden dates, monks who digitize ancient scrolls in secret, scientists who defy grants and ridicule to chase unapproved theories. They are the rebels of truth, the modern keepers of the flame. For every lock placed upon history, there is a hand somewhere holding a key. So tonight, as you lie in the hush of darkness, imagine these guardians not as faceless powers, but as torches glowing in the night of time. Some burn with greed, others with grace. Some shield humanity from its own shadows, others hide the stars to keep their crowns shining brighter. But no matter how many walls they build around truth, the dawn always finds a crack. The light always returns. Because truth, like the wind, cannot be owned, only carried. There comes a moment in every age when silence grows too heavy to hold, when buried truths press upward like roots seeking sunlight. The world does not always notice this moment. It begins softly, like the hum before a storm. But something shifts. A fragment of truth escapes a vault. A forbidden artifact is photographed. A word once erased reappears in a scholar's translation. The guardians stir, the narrative trembles. And then, suddenly, what was once unthinkable becomes undeniable. The lie begins to crumble, not in anger or revolution, but in quiet recognition. Humanity, weary from illusion, starts to remember itself. It begins with a question. A young archaeologist uncovers a stone tablet in a cave untouched by time. Its symbols are older than writing itself, yet it speaks of stars, not as gods, but as homes. She sends her findings to a journal. They are dismissed as fantasy. But the thought lingers. Others find similar carvings across continents, all depicting the same celestial alignments. How could civilizations separated by oceans draw the same skies? The pattern repeats, coincidences too consistent to ignore. And though the institutions deny it, the truth moves freely now, carried by voices online, by dreamers, by the restless curiosity that has always been humanity's oldest fire. The awakening is not a single event, but a gathering of light. Historians who once mocked forbidden theories begin to notice connections between myths and geology, between scripture and science. The floods described in sacred texts align perfectly with Ice Age sea level charts. Ancient walls once thought symbolic match real coastlines now submerged beneath the oceans. What was dismissed as allegory becomes archaeology. Slowly, the past reassembles itself, revealing a tapestry that stretches far beyond the timeline we were taught, one in which lost civilizations, celestial teachers, and cycles of destruction all coexist not as legend, but as memory. Meanwhile, people begin to feel something stir inside themselves. It is not knowledge, exactly, it is remembrance. As if their souls recognize the rhythm of an older truth, long buried beneath routine and disbelief. Dreams grow vivid, intuitions sharpen. Artists paint scenes of ancient skies they've never studied. Musicians compose melodies that echo forgotten chants. Children speak of stars with strange familiarity. The awakening, it seems, is not only in books or ruins, it is in the human spirit, relearning the sound of its own origins. Yet awakening is rarely peaceful. As new truths rise, old systems tremble. The powers that built their thrones on certainty feel the ground shifting beneath them. They release distractions, denials, and debates, smoke to confuse the seekers. But something in the collective heart has already changed. The guardians who once controlled knowledge now face a world of open eyes. The internet, though imperfect, becomes a new kind of library of Alexandria, unburnable, interconnected, alive. Whispers of ancient technologies, star maps, and hidden histories ripple through the web. Some stories are false, some exaggerated, but beneath the noise, the pulse of truth grows louder. Humanity is remembering what it was never meant to forget. As the illusion fractures, something else becomes clear. History was never a single line, but a spiral, a pattern of rise and fall, ignorance and illumination. Every civilization that thought itself eternal eventually met the same horizon. But perhaps the point was never to preserve the past perfectly, it was to learn, to evolve, to integrate the forgotten wisdom each time the spiral turns. Maybe this is why truth hides, not to punish us, but to invite us to rediscover it anew, each age with fresh eyes. The lie, then, is not merely deceit, it is the veil that forces us to seek. In this realization, fear fades. Humanity begins to forgive itself for not knowing, for believing the stories written by conquerors. People start to listen differently to the earth, to each other, to the silence between words. Ancient temples once seen as relics become resonant spaces again, vibrating with sound and meditation. Science opens its borders to philosophy, spirituality embraces data. A new synthesis emerges, knowledge and wisdom reunited after millennia of exile. The old separation between myth and fact dissolves like dawn mist, and truth, at last, stands unguarded. But the most profound awakening is personal. Alone in the quiet of night, one might feel the universe breathing not as something distant, but as something within. The stars above are not cold fires, but reflections of the same light that burns behind human eyes. The ancients who built pyramids, carved monoliths, and charted the heavens were not strangers, they were us, in another dream. Every generation is both the guardian and the seeker of truth. The lie was never total, it was only the forgetting. And so, the final revelation is gentle. History may have been rewritten, but the truth was never destroyed. It lived in stories, in symbols, in art, in the yearning for something more. It lives still in the wonder of a child, in the scientist who questions accepted facts, in the poet who dares to imagine eternity. The awakening is not a rebellion, it is a remembering. A return to the harmony we lost when we began measuring the world instead of feeling it. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine standing on the edge of time. Before you stretches every civilization that ever was: Atlantis rising from silver waves, the pyramids gleaming under twin moons, temples humming with sacred geometry, libraries glowing with eternal light. You realize that history was never linear, it is a living heartbeat. The past, present, and future all exist in this single breath. You are not outside of history, you are its continuation, its voice, its witness. And as the last veil lifts, the stars whisper not of gods or kings, but of possibility. They say, you were never meant to be told the truth, you were meant to find it. And in that moment, the lie dissolves completely, leaving only silence, vast, peaceful, and awake.